Well, peace, friends. I'm Pastor Tom Arthur from Sycamore Creek Church, and I'm really excited to be here with Lisle Gwynn Garrity. Did I pronounce that correctly?
You did, which well done. You get 5 stars because
All
that's
right.
most people
Five-star
pronounce
review.
it Lisle or Leslie.
You know what I'm remembering when we were talking about your name in worship, I actually went out and found a podcast or video or somebody how they pronounced it.
You
So
did your homework.
I did my homework.
That's impressive.
Lisle is a pastorist. I think that's a word that she made up because she is both an artist and an ordained pastor in the Presbyterian Church USA, which my wife grew up in that church, and her dad is a pastor, retired pastor now in the Presbyterian USA. She is also a retreat leader and a creative entrepreneur. She's the founder of Sanctified Art, a collaborative arts collective creating multimedia resources for churches. Lisle and her team resource worshiping congregations all across the globe. She believes in the prophetic and freeing power of art to connect us more deeply to God and one another, which all of that's like really close to Sycamore Creek's heart. And she's based in the beautiful rolling hills of Black Mountain, North Carolina. I spent a little bit of time in North Carolina myself at Duke when I was at seminary.
Nice.
I'm a Blue Devil pastor, much to the chagrin of most of my church.
I don't really have an allegiance, so you're safe here.
Okay. She's there with her husband, Paul, and she can also be found running with her wiggly pups, Max and Maven. Are they still pups?
No. But they are forever pups, right? They're like 7 and 8 years old, but they're pups.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, wherever I pulled this from and said pups. And she's also often tending to her ever-growing indoor and outdoor gardens. You can find out more about her by visiting LisleGwynnGarrity.com and sanctifiedart.org. So, Lisle, we've been using your series. I've been meaning to ask that you and it seems like a whole team put together over these last 4 weeks. It's been a wonderful, wonderful series. It's kind of, we always pick a series in the fall that's a church-wide series across all of our campuses. And then we read the book together. So in this case, you provided a booklet that our small groups are all working through right now, based around 4 questions. And those questions were, where do you come from? Where does it hurt? What do you need? And where do we go from here? I'm going to play I'm going to hold on that. So tell us first, this word pastorist, what is that all about?
The need to create a name for what felt I was accurately representing my vocation. And so much of my vocational journey has been how to integrate all the parts of myself and to acknowledge that the work that I am doing really invites me to be both a pastor and an artist fully. So I don't know, that word came to me one day. And so it just became the leading title. And obviously the best titles are made up. So hello, I'm pastorist. And it's a free term. I'm not trademarking it. So I love it if other folks want to utilize it. Yeah.
Now, there is a way in which I feel like a pastor by themselves is a kind of artist. You're a sort of performance artist on Sunday morning. A lot of pastors are also musicians. I happen to be a photography minor in college, so very visual. But I get the sense that this goes a little deeper for you than sort of the way that an average pastor thinks about, even if they do think about being an artist. Tell us a little more about the pastor side and the artist side.
Yeah, I really think that if I were to sum down all of what I do, my calling really is in using art and creativity as tools for spiritual formation. And so A Sanctified Art is a collective of artists and pastors, musicians, writers, and together we create what we call multimedia resources for ministry. Multimedia really just I think is the term we're using to make sure that we have a very open box, and that we are trying to create any sort of materials or resources, whether that's visual art or poetry or devotionals or curriculum or goodness, like banner designs for a sanctuary space, that what we're really trying to do is to use art and creativity for spiritual formation as well as nourishment. And then I think in the retreats that I lead, which I'm not doing quite as much anymore, because to be quite honest, my full vocation these days is with A Sanctified Art as we've grown over the years. But I do still feel deeply called to facilitate retreats. And in those spaces, a lot of the work that I'm doing is focused on collaborative creative process, where I'm inviting folks to gather around a table and to create together through the messy, unpredictable process of collaboration. And really, that is spiritual formation. I really believe that when you give yourself wholeheartedly to any creative process, that you see it through, that you inevitably will find yourself going through some version of a birth, some version of a life, some version of a death, and also a resurrection. So I really think that creative process shapes us and forms us spiritually.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite artist?
I think that's such an interesting question. I think a lot of the genesis for A Sanctified Art was coming from not feeling connected to a lot of what might be labeled sacred art. And a lot of that within the Western Christian tradition is very Eurocentric classical art. And that feeling like the only real expression of visual art that is available. And due to the Reformation, which had many positive, of course, positive effects, I think it led to a lack of visual connection and visual theology for a lot of Protestants. And so there was this move to turn away from anything that could be considered an idol or an icon, anything that was visual. And so we turned to this stark minimalism, which I love minimalism, and I love, a clean, minimal space architecturally. Like, there's beauty in that. But I think what it did is it removed any sort of visual connection from our spirituality. And so a lot of the faith communities that I interact with just don't have a very rich visual theology or a tradition or a practice of integrating visual art or knowing how to sit with an image and just be quiet with it and ask questions or contemplate it or engage your imagination and start to wonder, like, if you could step inside of this image, where would you be and how might God be speaking to you through that? I also think that I come from a tradition that is often labeled the frozen chosen. Presbyterians like to call themselves the frozen chosen. And that is very true in a lot of like the traditional iterations of worship that I grew up in. It's just like
decently and orderly.
Decently and in order, and you sit in the pew and you don't move and you stand up and you sing from the hymnal and you read from a bulletin, and that is how you express your faith. And I just felt so dissatisfied by that and so limited, and just like, there has to be more. There has to be richness that we can access when we are trying to curate sacred space and connect with each other and connect with God. And we have to have opportunities to integrate all of who we are and to have a more embodied spirituality. And so I think that's really what it's about for us, is like sanctified art is how do we recognize that the context of churches that we serve have this really complicated history when it comes to art and creative expression. And this is what it often looks like. And so we're trying to work within those constraints to introduce opportunities for creativity, opportunities for art. When I say art, I'm primarily referring to visual art, because music is a very familiar medium in those spaces. Well, except for many, it's the type of music that's acceptable, the acceptable style of music. So
and
that's a whole other. And instrumentation, yes, there are definitely some
the frozen chosen instrumentation.
Yes, you're right. Or like if there's not an organ, then it's not worship or it's not church, right? But I have really witnessed how COVID freed us from a lot of that. And our work with A Sanctified Art actually just expanded pretty exponentially during COVID and afterward. And I think of all of the tragedy and grief and disruption of the pandemic, that is something that I've noticed, is that there is more openness. There is more digital literacy, which allows us to transfer these multimedia resources because they're in a digital format so that you can then bring them to life in the ways that you need to. And there's just a more, I think, recognition that we are highly visual people. And especially now with technology, we do engage on all visual mediums all day long, on our phones, on our screens. And so if we're not integrating and paying attention to the theology of the visual, then we're ignoring a major part of culture and life and ways of connection.
So right now I'm resisting the temptation to go down the theological hole.
I know there's so much we could talk about.
Because I think that would just be playing into exactly the opposite of what you're trying to do, of this being all a head game, or worship being something that we just do with our minds or our heads. Of course, that is really important. But it feels to me like what your sense, your vocation, your calling is around sanctified art has more to do with this embodied nature of worship. We're going to get into it just a minute, but if you happen to just be joining us, I'm here with Lisle Gwynn Garrity, who is the pastorist. She's pastor and artist. She's the founder of Sanctified Art, which our church has just wrapped up this last Sunday, a 5-week series on. And it's based around 4 questions. Where do you come from? Where does it hurt? What do you need? And where do we go from here? And we're talking first, just getting to know Lisle a little bit, and then we're going to get into some of her art here in just a minute. Do you have a favorite piece or kind of sacred art, whether that's icons or stained glass, music, musicals, mosaics, statues? I mean, or dance. Is there a favorite for you personally?
Again, it's so interesting because I think so much of my work emerged from what I felt was missing, or just wanting to name a disconnect. So I think I'll talk a little bit about an art form that I do really love, which is live painting in worship, and offering a visual proclamation that coincides with the sermon, the music, the prayers, the rituals of a space, and allowing that creative process to be fully transparent and shared by a community is so spiritually rich for me. And it's something that I do less often these days just because I'm not traveling as much, but I love the way that a community can start with a blank canvas with me. And I always have an image composition mapped out in my mind, but so much of that process for me is surrender. And the more free and just the more free and open I can be as somebody who personality-wise trends toward wanting to be controlled and detailed and improve everything in the world and try to achieve perfection, the more messy and uncertain and open I can be in that process, the better the result always. So it really is and doing it live in a community means I don't have time to think twice about it. I just have to keep going. So I don't allow fear to just come in and deconstruct my process, which, to be quite honest, is interesting because when I'm creating here in my home studio, creating works for Sanctified Art, it is so much harder because that fear voice just it digs in and it gets in deep, and it just it can stall my process. So I'm talking about live painting because it's really, for me, the experience of it that I'm so drawn to. And it's not something that I had really seen a lot of people doing in the world. So I don't think that I don't think that my calling was really wrapped up in like seeing sacred art from other people and offered in a way that was really compelling to me. It was like, actually, there's a lack of this, or a lack of art that I think really moves me. And so I need to experience that for myself. Now, artists that captured my imagination, French Impressionists were my first love as a painter, just being able to see the way that they were focused on capturing the impression of light and movement and energy. I really didn't care what the subject matter was, because I was so captivated by the texture of the paint strokes and the movement and the energy there. And that, you know, historically was radical, as these like French Impressionists were creating their own little galleries outside of the museum and the institution of the museum. And they were, you know, scandalized for that. But and there's all kinds of stuff with the bourgeoisie establishment and the way they were trying to rebel against it. Anyway, but I think I don't really find myself, you know, saying, wow, this is sacred art and this is secular art. I don't really see that as a divide that categorizes the art that I'm captivated by. So there are definitely modern artists that I'm deeply compelled by. I'm just trying to think of all the.
So when you go to an art museum, you're going to church.
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of it is really being compelled by the story of a piece, because for me, I just have never been, I think that's part of why I'm like not an artist that pursued making paintings and selling them in a gallery, because I'm just really not interested in the final product. I've always just been more interested in process, which is why I answered your question by talking about live painting.
Yeah.
But like, you know, there's some, when I know more about the story of a piece and what it's trying to do, I'm really interested in what art can do. Then I'm very captivated. So like one piece of art that's coming to mind right now is the Rumors of War sculpture outside of the museum in Richmond, the Fine Art Museum, VMFA, I believe.
Okay.
And it is so incredibly moving. Maybe we can drop a link so that people have a little bit of context. But anyway, that knowing some of the context and the cultural, political factors impacting that work, and then standing underneath it and just walking around it, it's really, really captivating and compelling. Yeah. So.
Well, let's get to the actual series I've been meaning to ask. And I'm gonna play the roll-in that we created for this series, just so if people are watching it and they're not familiar with it, they can get a little bit familiar with it before we talk about it. So here's I've been meaning to ask.
Some of our best conversations start with good questions we've been meaning to ask. Questions that keep us curious, and questions that lead us deeper into courage and connection. We've crafted this series around 4 guiding questions. I've been meaning to ask, where are you from? Where does it hurt? What do you need? Where do we go from here? These questions aren't surface level. They invite us to tell our stories, share our pain, care for one another, and dream about a new way forward together. Join Sycamore Creek for this 5-week series on Sundays in October, and join a small group this fall to explore these questions deeper.
So talk to us a little bit about where this series came from for you, for Sanctified Art.
Yeah. Well, A Sanctified Art truly is a collective, and we are a creative team of 5. And then with every bundle or worship series that we craft, we intentionally collaborate with guest artists, musicians, writers. So the genesis for I've been meaning to ask is that we were in 2020 and we were trying to do some planning around more of a theme-based worship series that could be really meaningful for folks, as we were noticing just the divisiveness of that time, the complete and utter burnout for clergy who were having to learn 5 million new types of jobs and tasks and ways of technology and just like ways of doing ministry. And so we polled our community. We have a Facebook community group where a lot of our folks collaborate and connect when they're using our resources. And we polled them and just said, hey, we're in the early stages of planning a theme-based series that doesn't follow a particular lectionary cycle or season. And what theme or subject matter is really calling to you right now? And across the board, the response was something focused on community and how we live in it, how we participate in it, how we build it. So contextually, keep in mind that we were all still distancing in the early stages of creating these materials, right? And so we had set all of our conversations as a creative team start with how can we serve our larger community? What will speak? What will be meaningful? And so we just started talking about this like theme around community, and so much of it just started with naming the realities that so many of us were experiencing, and the way also just the political divides that we were all experiencing. And I think every one of us could name people that we were distanced from in the aftermath of the elections. And so we were just like, how do we do this? And we just kept asking questions and realizing, I think part of it was just the basics, getting back to the basics and really thinking about curiosity as a spiritual practice. And so that's where the series started to form. And somebody in the group just named, what if the series were titled, I've been meaning to ask ... with this really intentional ellipsis, like I've been meaning to ask, I'm pausing. I'm pausing because I want to listen. I'm pausing because I don't exactly know how to say this because this is hard, right? I'm pausing because I want to keep connecting with you, and I want to reach out and I want to understand you. And so we crafted these 4 questions, and we realized we really wanted to start with, how do we tell our story? And where are you from can be a really racially and ethnically derogatory question sometimes. Like it can often be like, tell me where you're actually from. And so we wanted to, you're not where I expect you to be. You're not carrying the label I expect you to carry. So tell me where you really from. It's like, so that question is loaded, and we wanted to acknowledge that, but also part of the spiritual practice of this series is trying to remove the assumptions we carry about people. That's, for all of us, which is so hard. And to truly just ask unassuming questions with gentleness and with genuine curiosity, not like a probing attack, but right. Like I think a lot of this series comes with caveats of like, how do we really create space that feels safe and that we can trust each other here and we can be vulnerable. But how do we tell our stories, and how do we hear, like, where are you from is such an interesting question, because it's not just about like, where do you live? It's like, what has shaped you? Tell me the story of who you are. Who are the people in your life who have turned you into who you are? What decisions, what life paths, right? And then we wanted to really ask questions. The next question came from, where do you hurt? That we're going right in for it.
Deep vulnerability.
Yeah. And we had heard Ruby Sales ask that question. I think in an On Being interview with Krista Tippett. I think that's where we had first heard that question of, where does it hurt? But what we liked about that question is that it doesn't ask, are you okay? Or how are you doing? Because we wanted to avoid some of the kind of generalities that we all get trapped in, and really create space for true connection. And so asking that question, where do you hurt? I think acknowledges that all of us do carry hurts, and we all do carry wounds. And I think a lot of us are not willing to unearth them or to expose them. So that is part of that work of building conversations in trusted spaces. But we wanted to also integrate scripture passages where we feature a human who is hurting and ask, where is God in this, right? And so, and then after that, what do you need became the third question. And we went back and forth around that, because what we were trying to avoid was, how can I help? Because what we want to avoid is centering ourselves in the story of your pain, or the part of this is deconstructing a lot of the very savioristic missionary mindset of many churches, where we come in thinking we have all the answers and all the solutions to everyone. Really, what we're trying to do with this series is say, we're here to listen. Again, trying to remove assumptions. And I think this is a really hard thing. I've found that question really shaped me in my own relationships, because when someone I know is hurting, it's so tempting to go into fixer mode and to want to say, can I do this for you? Can I do that? And sometimes it is helpful to just say, can I bring you some food, right? But we wanted to also provide space for someone to say, what do you need? Because it also invites you to try to name that for yourself, which is really difficult. It's really difficult to name what you need sometimes. So
don't always know either.
We don't always know. But part of that question is that we need to be asking or leaning into these questions as a community and individually. And then that last question is, where do we go from here? Was really designed to be the contextual question that each church is asking of themselves, and asking also on an individual level, like, what have you learned? What have you gained? What does this mean for your own relationships? What does this mean for the family members that you sat across the table with at Thanksgiving, who you wanted to leave the table at Thanksgiving, right? What does this mean? What does this mean for your church and whatever transitions you're undergoing? What does this mean, right? So where do we go from here? Again, obviously very open-ended, but that question, I think, comes with a responsibility from all individuals who are involved in that conversation. So that's where we landed. And so we shaped all these materials and curriculum around those questions, and invited some guest partners to create alongside us and to respond to those questions from their stories, from their perspectives, from their life experiences. So yeah, I would love to hear how you think your church and your community is resonating with those questions.
Yeah.
And I'm not asking for individual stories. I'm asking more as, like, if you were to speak on behalf of the whole community, where does your church hurt? Like, where are you going? Where do you come from? I would love to know.
Yeah. Well, let me, I'm happy to share a little bit of that, but let me just put up and share a bit about where we took this. And so, as you mentioned, this is an art collective. So there's these 3 artists who produced a series of artwork that we then created and put into banners. You can see those on the stage there. And then a little bit close up here of all the different banners and pieces of artwork. And then each one has, as you mentioned, a couple of Bible stories with it, and some poetry, and just maybe that's kind of the way you described, like your multimedia resources. And you had mentioned to me earlier that you met some resistance, or some churches have met resistance, because there's a vulnerability implied in those questions, or in the whole thing. And Sycamore Creek comes from a place that's pretty vulnerable, safe, I think, as a whole. We're a relatively newer United Methodist Church, so we're 23 years old. Actually, this November will be 23. I'm the second pastor, so I followed the founding pastor. At this point, we're a multi-site with 3 campuses. None of them, we don't have a mega church campus, or they're all just 3 thriving small to medium-sized churches. So we didn't meet any resistance. And I was curious to hear more like what you were hearing from churches with that, and how we overcome that, or how churches overcome that. We didn't have a lot of work to do with that. I think people were ready to talk about it. And I can see that, particularly from my campus, which is the newest one. This series opened our grand opening of a campus. And it was an adoption of a church that was struggling. And they were down to 15 to 20 people post-COVID. And we adopted them, but we shut it down for a year, remodeled it as a performing arts center that we call Stage One. So there are local community theater groups that use the space. And then we have an incubator kitchen in the basement as well. And the basement church kitchen. It's a licensed kitchen that food startup businesses can work in. So we added a 5th week to it I've been meaning to ask about Sycamore Creek.
Cool.
And I had a panel of people from Eastwood. Now, the 3 campus pastors, we all recorded a video of us talking about those questions, and we took them. Where are you from? Like, where is your campus from? Like, where are the people from your campus from? What's a hurt that you see in your campus, and so on, and ran the campuses through each of those 4 questions, and videotaped that. And at the other 2 campuses, they showed that video of all 3 of us. At my campus, because it's brand new, I pulled a panel of 6 people from our church, from our campus. Most of them a year ago I didn't even know. And I ran those questions through those 6 people, and that was the message for the day. And you hear, I mean, it was a really beautiful, moving, people being vulnerable in front of a whole performing arts center worth of people, talking about where they're from and where it hurts and what they need. We kind of framed those last 2 questions. What's one thing that you need for Sycamore Creek to meet?
Yeah.
And then what's one place you feel like we should go from here as a campus or a church? And again, at this point, our church, this campus is 5 weeks old as far as meeting weekly. There had been a lot of work up before the grand opening. So people, again, shared very freely. There's a lot of, like, we as a campus and church as a whole, we're a LGBTQ affirming church, but we are not liturgical. So if you didn't fit in your church for whatever reason, or become spiritually curious at some point, and you're looking for a church in the Lansing region, and you were part of like a evangelical non-denominational or something that wasn't liturgical or formal, we're about it. Like, there's not anything else in Sycamore or in Lansing that's not liturgical. You can find affirming churches, but they all are liturgical or formal in some way or another. So we've ended up with what I often call like the gay evangelical diaspora of people who in their Pentecostal church or mega church evangelical or whatever didn't fit. And that was a lot of like that question. A lot of the answers around that were along those lines. And then around, like, I had 2 people from the church that we adopted up there as well. And they, some of the hurt was that not everybody stuck with us through that adoption. So we tried to be as clear and upfront as we could be and transparent about the changes, but I think a lot of people, when they voted like, hey, we're going to give this church the building, and then we're going to go find another traditional United Methodist church, which a lot of them did. So there's some hurt around that. And then one of the more interesting things that we heard around the where do we go from here was, or one of the more interesting things to me was we do a lot of anti-racism work, a lot of racial equity work, a lot of inclusion of LGBTQ. But we don't do as much around disability. And so that was a place that folks were, I heard people describing, maybe this is a place that we should go.
Yeah.
From here.
Wow.
Being more intentional in that. So it's been a really positive experience. I don't know that we have done, I think this may be happening more in the small groups because we professionally printed the booklets that you all provided. And in those are all of these pieces of art. And so while we had the banners on stage, I don't know that we engaged the art as much other than it just being present in the worship space. And so the booklets guide people through that. But I'm curious, and we've got maybe about 5 more minutes. We'll pick one of these, and 3 of these are yours.
Yeah.
And then the rest of them are the other 2 artists that I showed at the beginning. But do you have a favorite? And maybe you can engage with us a little bit on how engaging art can be transformative or a spiritual practice for maybe the small groups who are listening to this or will listen to this as they engage it in the booklet.
Yeah, sure. So I'd be happy to talk about that image scene that you showed. And first of all, if I can show you where that process started for all of those pieces because I have them laid out. But my process always begins on canvas or with real paint in my hands. And then I move to a digital format after that. So one of the most freeing things I can do, honestly, is just put down an unstretched canvas on my work table back here and just start painting and not have any restrictions around a perfect composition and just have the freedom to roam, because then I can crop smaller pieces, or what I actually do is photograph them and then move them into a digital format and draw with a program called Procreate, which is still a stylus. It's not AI, but it's I feel like I have to clarify.
You're talking about this is scene.
Yes. Well, all of them began from photographs
so break open and ever wider are.
Yeah, I have about 8 of these that I ended up matting.
Gotcha.
And they're listed on our website if anyone's interested. But the original inspiration was to create these abstract visual orchestras of conversations. And I was trying to move through these warm tones and these cold tones and try to visually map out the ebb and flow of a courageous conversation. And so I have all these kind of dotted textures with Conte crayon and chalk and pencil and graphite, and just trying to, like, the ways that our conversations can meander and move and go in circles, and there's pauses and awkward space. And so I was trying to really just capture the visual landscape of a courageous conversation. So you see some of that with all these dappled textures and in acrylic paint, and I have a bunch of them out here. But that's where my process began. Then I photograph them, and then I sometimes will collage those photos together into the exact composition that I want to then feature the image that I draw. So with that image scene, that's inspired by a story of Hannah, who is essentially mocked for being perceived infertile. And she goes back and forth to the temple and kind of bears herself before God, and ultimately is granted a child. But I wanted to capture, I don't know if you have that image to show, but it's that one right there called Scene. I wanted to put each of the drawings within this landscape of the visual orchestra, right? This visual, courageous conversation, and place them within that kind of harmony and cacophony. And I wanted us to really see her, because I think that that is what's compelling to me about that story, is the fact that she finally is truly seen by God in her pain and not mocked for it. And so I was drawing her face and wanted her face to have more of a 3D fullness. But then as I got to her body, I really was not interested in those details. And I started to notice that I wanted that to just sort of be more transparent. So I just did a white layer for her body. And I realized that what I was trying to say was I wanted to highlight the vulnerability that she exudes, but also the way that she feels invisible. And so in this moment, I'm inviting us as viewers to just acknowledge her and to truly see her and to see her pain, and how transformative it can be when we are truly seen. And I think often what we need is to be seen, and to be heard, and to have someone say, gosh, that is so hard. And I see you and I hear you and I'm with you. And that's what I want us to do for her, for Hannah, but also ultimately for our neighbors and for ourselves, right? Like sometimes we just need to be able to have that same compassion for ourselves. So I think in terms of how do you gain some sort of, how do you connect spiritually with a piece of art? You don't have to like the art. I think part of it is just paying attention. So we often use a practice called Visio Divina, where it's just a simple practice of silence and looking at an image together in silence. And a leader will offer prompts. And those prompts can be something like, first, just notice what you see. Pay attention to the colors, the textures, just scan the image, take it all in, take some deep breaths, try to calm your mind, quiet your mind, calm your body. And then after a few moments of silence, another prompt might be, take a closer look. What parts of the image are you immediately drawn to? And what parts of the image did you miss? Now scan everything again, and just trying to take a deeper look. And you start to notice things. And there might be certain details that you're like, wow, that's so interesting. And you might be thinking about how the first thing that drew you in was the teardrop. And, oh gosh, I didn't even notice that the rest of her body was drawn in that white transparent layer. I didn't even think about that, right? So it allows that space to kind of sit with it. And then, another question after some silence might be, engage your imagination. How might you, or how, if you could place yourself in this painting, if you could step inside of the world of this art, where would you be and why? What would you be doing? How would you feel? And so that, again, is just like coming face to face with Hannah, and what would you be feeling and what would you be doing? Or are you Hannah? Do you see yourself in Hannah? So then after those silent prompts together, we love opening it up for conversation. I think I just always learn something about how people see, what people think about, and then ultimately what people see in the scripture, because all of our art is inspired by scripture. So it really opens a window into the text in a whole new way, and provides a new way of thinking about the story and thinking about God, how God might be speaking to you through it, which I can find really powerful. So if you are doing that in small groups, if you're using the devotional in small groups, I really encourage you to do some of that silence and just some prompts together, and then talking about what you see.
Yeah.
It's not complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. We did a staff retreat, spiritual retreat. I don't know why I didn't think to mention this, where we just spent the day at a retreat center and worked through the booklet together. And we would, I think your artist statements are really helpful for helping people who aren't super artsy, like to engage the work. So, because you describe some of that in your artist statement in the booklet. But so we're running out of time here, but there's a couple of things here I put up on the screen if people want to follow you or become more familiar with you. LisleGwynnGarrity.com or sanctifiedart.org. And are you on Instagram, or I guess it's called X now, formerly known as Twitter? Are there other places where people can keep in touch with you?
I think the best way to keep in touch with my work is through A Sanctified Art. That's the main focus of my work right now. Yeah. So we're just Sanctified Art on all platforms.
Okay.
Yeah. So Instagram, Facebook, you can find us there.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Lisle, for being with us today, and even more so for creating this resource for our church and many, many more, I'm sure. We look forward to seeing what more you come up with. I noticed that I think you've come out with a new Advent series.
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
So if you're not familiar with that, you can take a look at that. But we're thankful for those of you who've watched either live with us. I've seen a couple of faithful people on through this whole thing, and several pop in and out.
That's great.
And this will be available on all of our channels afterwards for people to listen to or watch at their leisure. Again, thank you so much, Lisle. And friends, until we see you again, be curious, be creative, be compassionate, and peace out.